We're strolling the streets of Frankfort, folks. On behalf of the Frankfort Franklin County Tourist and Convention Commission, welcome to our walking tour. On this particular occasion, we have several folk on occasion want to know how Frankfort got to be the capital of Kentucky. Why this little town compared to, say, Louisville or Lexington? Well, we got it the good old American way. We bought it. Back in the 1792 period, when we became a state and we were searching for a capital for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Lexington, Louisville, about a mile down the road, Leestown, Frankfort, and over in Woodford County, Petersburg, and another little town called Nonesuch were all vying for the capital. Well, a fellow by the name of Andrew Holmes, who actually lived in Lexington but owned a lot of property in Frankfort, realized the value of making Frankfort the capital city. So he got together from the townspeople. The town started about 1786. So he got together with the townspeople and raised about $3,000 cash. And then this huge square that you see here was donated for the early state to build its capitol buildings upon. So with the land and with some building supplies, and especially that $3,000 cash, and the Kentucky River, that made a big difference. Some folks have said, well, Louisville's got a river, the Ohio River, why didn't they get it? Actually, back in those days, you had to portage in order to get down the Ohio River at Louisville. The Portland Canal, perhaps you folks are familiar with that, that's where all that came from. So it really wasn't as good a deal as you might think back in 1792. But Frankfort was a perfect spot. So we became the capital the good old American way. We bought it. Another one of our questions that are quite often asked, how did Frankfort get its name? Well, tradition says that we got its name based on an incident that occurred just a short distance from us here on the Kentucky River. To get from Louisville to Lexington, one had to always cross the Kentucky River. So the settlers found the narrowest point and would find the deepest spot in order to make that cross. Well, they, of course, knew where this was, but the Indians knew as well. So in 1780, some settlers were on their way to Louisville, an assault expedition. They were ambushed by the Indians. And the Indians shot one of the men, killed one of the men by the name of Stephen Frank. So that was called Frank's Ford from thenceforth. They would cross the river at the ford where Stephen Frank got shot. Well, the Kentucky River was a lot different in those days than it is today. We didn't have the locks on the river at that time, and it was more rather lengthy rivulets. You'd have a lot of rocks. This area here that you see was a lot lower then. This has been built up over the years, and this area was often swampy. Sometimes a pool of water would be here, all the way up to Fort Hill behind us. And it was one of those situations where this land actually was pretty much worthless until James Wilkinson and his men came in and cleared the area and created the little town of Frankfort in 1786. But in 1780, this was a wild, remote area full of mosquitoes, full of swampiness, and very worthless land at the time. But in 6 years, James Wilkinson had a good idea about making this a base of operations to send goods down the Kentucky River, down the Ohio River, down to New Orleans to trade. We'll get to that story a little later on. This building you see here is our third building as a capital for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. The first two buildings burned to the ground. So consequently, they built this one between 1827 and 1830. The architect of this beautiful building was Gideon Schrock, who was out of Lexington, Kentucky, and he was only 24 years old. This was basically his first project. The columns you see are 33 feet tall, high, and the width of the columns is 4 feet. The blocks of stone that make up the walls, that's called bird's eye limestone. If you look closely, you can see little black flecks in that limestone, and to those that built it, it looked to them like bird's eyes, so they called it bird's eye limestone. That was quarried from the Kentucky River from Anderson County around Tyrone all the way down to Frankfort, Kentucky. Of course, this beautiful building was in use from about 1830 till 1910 when we built the new Capitol over in South Frankfort. Inside is some marvelous designs that were created by the architect Gideon Schrock, one of which is his famous staircase, which the keystone that holds it together, if it is removed, the staircase itself would collapse. And obviously, we don't want that to happen, so nobody's going to remove that keystone. The building next door comes much later. It was in 1870 approximately when they built this building. The idea was to build an identical building like it on the other side of the Capitol building here. Well, after they finished it, they realized that even if they did, they still wouldn't have enough room to accommodate all the state office workers, the governor and the lieutenant governor and all the others involved, including state employees. It still wouldn't be enough room. So they never built the other building. However, there was a building on the other side. It was called the Little Red Building. It burned to the ground. Fire was one of our biggest problems in the early days of the settlers, not just in Frankfort, but all over, because we didn't get the fires put out very quickly. Most of our lighting was through candles or tallow and oil and that sort of thing, and that's the reason people went to bed early at night. Early to bed, early to rise. You kind of went with the sun and with the night. In 1900, from this corner, about the second floor or so, shots were fired, and they killed a man. This is where he fell, right over here. His name was William Goebel. He fell on this spot January 30th, 1900. The bullets fired from that building entered into his chest, ricocheted around inside, cracked his ribs and punctured his lungs, and within a few days he was dead. William Goebel, he was a senator who was running for governor. This is one of those political situations where the Democrats and the Republicans were duking it out. In the election, the Democrats lost. The Republicans had won their spot in office. Well, the Democrats just weren't going to accept it. They wanted a recount, and they had the recount, and the Republicans still won. So the Democrats decided we'll get this by sending it into the courts. And the courts were primarily made up of Democrats, so consequently it fell to the Democrats and Mr. Goebel, who had been wounded. Well, he only made it for 3 days as governor, but during that time it changed the seat. In fact, it was amazing. For the first several months, we had 2 seats of government. The Republicans would not give up their spot, and the Democrats were holed up in another section of town. Let's go down and take a look at Mr. Goebel himself. He was born in a log cabin in Pennsylvania, and his family moved to what is Covington, Kentucky today. He never learned to speak English until he was about 6 years old. As he grew up there in northern Kentucky, he got involved with some lawyers and former governor and got involved in politics. And he eventually became a senator. And he had this idea of becoming governor. He was just a young man. He was what they call a preemie when he was born, just a couple of pounds. So it's a wonder that he made it as long as he did as far as his life was concerned when he was shot by the bullet of an assassin. Here's his statue here. This statue that we have here on Broadway in front of the old Capitol was originally supposed to be in the Frankfort Cemetery. The statue you see in the Frankfort Cemetery, he has his arms outstretched, and it is really a more commodious statue than perhaps the one here. He looks rather defiant with his arms crossed and his face stern, looking out to the people. This particular monument originally stood over in South Frankfort in front of the new Capitol. It was right down there in front of the new Capitol where the road is, and it became a traffic hazard. People started running into it. They were probably disgruntled Republicans who wanted to get back at the Democrats. But neither way, Bert Combs, during his governorship, in the middle of the night, moved that statue over here during the last weeks of his term as governor of Kentucky. He figured nobody would say anything or what much they could do because he would have already moved the monument here and nobody could say anything about it. Here are the famous last words of Governor William Goebel. "Tell my friends to be brave and fearless and loyal to the great common people." His last words. Well, they are very inspiring, I'm sure, but in reality, we often wonder if that indeed was his last words. Irvin S. Cobb, who was a journalist and an actor of sorts with Will Rogers in the early 1900s, this was his first story that he covered for a Louisville newspaper. So he went to the doctor and was doing some informing information, and in his book, Exit Laughing, we find this story. He asked the doc, well, what exactly happened there on Goebel's deathbed? And the doctor said, well, you know, he had his favorite meal that night, which was oysters. And when he finished, he wiped his mouth, and he looked over at me and he said, you know, Doc, those sure were pretty damn bad oysters. And then he died. So if we had that on the front of the monument here, that might not be the best thing to represent Kentucky and the capital of Kentucky. But he was an interesting fellow. He never married. He was of swarthy complexion. He really wasn't a very good orator or speaker, but he was a great organizer. He could really get the counties behind him, and obviously he, for a few days, served as governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. The railroad tracks that you see running down in the middle of Frankfort, Kentucky, was the second railroad in the United States. It ran from Lexington to Frankfort, but it didn't come downtown in the early stages. It ran to about between Kentucky State University and the Frankfort Cemetery. There was a depot up at that point where you would get off the train and then get onto a windlass conveyance that would actually lower you into Frankfort downtown. We have hills all around Frankfort, Kentucky, and it was just too dangerous to try to let a train come down a hill. And so they didn't do it. They used a windlass. Now, the early days of the railroad were not very successful. It took about 4 to 5 hours to come the short 20-plus miles from Lexington to Frankfort, because originally, instead of using a steam engine, they used horses to pull the trains. So it took a rather lengthy time to get it here. And the depot that you see present in town, just on the other side of the traffic lights there on the right side of Broadway here, that was built in the early 1900s. In its place, at one time in that area, stood a log cabin that was the home of Reverend John Gannot. He was the Revolutionary War chaplain for George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And he is believed to have baptized George Washington. In fact, this past year, this past summer, there was up at the Frankfort Cemetery, a Baptist organization which has put a big, huge monument and marker at his grave commemorating this fact that we believe today. Now, at the end of the railroad tracks, you see a black hole down there amongst the trees. Well, that is where the train tunnel is located. That was built about 1849, and then shortly after that, they put a bridge across the Kentucky River so that you could have the trains running from Lexington to Frankfort all the way to Louisville and back. In fact, originally the trains would stop here in Frankfort, and the train that would come from Louisville would stop on the other side of the river, and they would just let the passengers kind of ferry their way across either on a boat or walk across on a bridge because they were concerned about the weight. But as years went on and we created some better methods of transportation, it became a viable project. Now, if you'll take a look across the street over here to the old Gershman building, you'll see a face up on the side of the wall. A face that is rather stern in its appearance. The fellow has a mustache. He has what looks to me like horns. And we talked with the folks that own the building, and they really don't know any reason for that face being on the wall. They have no idea. In all the years that the Gershman family were there, they never found out. But we see the face and its direction that it's looking, and it's going toward the state government building, the Capitol. And I guess with the politicians, on occasion, they need to be watched rather closely. So this watchdog over the years has watched the seat of government here for quite some time. In fact, in the late 1880s, we had a situation where the treasurer of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, he one day did not show up for work. His name was Honest Dick Tate. Not only was he not at work, but the treasury was also missing as well. Over $250,000 he stole and took off for parts unknown. Never came back, as far as we know, to Kentucky. So that's another reason why we need some watchdogs up there to look after our politicians. The square that we talked about here, where the government buildings are located, on this corner behind you was the location, the site of the first courthouse at Lewis Street and Broadway. It would be destroyed by fire. On the other corner behind the building adjacent to the old Capitol was our first arsenal. It too was destroyed by fire. On this corner up here, the corner of Madison and Broadway, was the first church in the city of Frankfort. Originally, the churches were outlying in the county areas, and the churches really didn't want to get into town because this is where profanity and the river rat people and sin was going on, so we didn't have a church. So the Commonwealth of Kentucky, through Kentucky's very first lottery, raised $4,000 to build this church right down here on the corner. And it was used by the Baptists and the Presbyterians, and they worked out different scheduling of times, and they would be in it from one week to the next, and it kind of worked very well. But then when the Methodists came along and decided they wanted to be a part of it, well, it was about time then to go ahead and build churches in our downtown area as opposed to using this building. When our government building, the state building, burnt, those first two, they wound up using this church for the legislature to meet in. Then eventually it burned to the ground, so we have nothing here today. I mentioned Madison Alley here. It runs and ran at one time all the way down to Fort Hill. But over the years, in the 1970s, when they built the John C. Watts Federal Building, they took out the houses that were here, and they also took out Madison Alley. It was named for this man, Governor George Madison. Madison had been in the Revolutionary War. He had been injured on several occasions by bullets during the Revolutionary War. In the Indian Wars, he was also wounded by the Indians. So he was a very popular and favorite son of the settlers here in Kentucky. When he decided to run for governor of Kentucky, nobody would run against him because they knew he was so popular they couldn't win. So George Madison, he didn't have to buy any television time or put up any signs in his front yard, and he was automatically elected governor of Kentucky. But within a few short weeks, he died. He had a disease that got the best of him. So he winds up having the rank of being our first governor to die in office. Another house that was on this same corner besides Madison was the home of John Marshall Harlan. John Marshall Harlan, his daddy was born down in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, but he came to Frankfort when John Marshall Harlan was just a little boy, and he grew up here in our town. He had named him son for the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. Little did he realize that his own son would become a Supreme Court Justice years later. John Marshall Harlan was a Supreme Court Justice following the Civil War, and he received quite a bit of attention because he would not go along with some of the laws and some of the ideas that Congress were trying to pass, because these laws were really detrimental to the southern states and quite often were unfair to blacks, the slaves. So consequently, he dissented. He became known as the dissenter. In 1972, they did a survey of all of our Supreme Court justices, and John Marshall Harlan ranked up as in the top 12. So he was really considered to be a very good judge. Recently, he's been in the news. His wife that he married when she was only 17 had kept a journal and a record of their life together for about 50 years during their marriage. So I'm anxious to see a copy of this work, to learn more about the city of Frankfort, and to get a woman's perspective on such a famous man as her husband. His grandson, John Marshall Harlan III, was also a Supreme Court justice under Dwight David Eisenhower in the 50s. There's another house that was quite famous, and it was located right up here, just to the left of this tree here. It was the home of Solomon P. Sharp. Solomon P. Sharp was everything that his name indicates. He was a sharp-looking man, sharp mind, very intelligent. His only problem was women. He was from down in Bowling Green, Kentucky, a lawyer down there. He'd gotten involved with a woman by the name of Ann Cook, and she gets pregnant. He leaves, comes to Frankfort, Kentucky. He begins to climb in fame. He's one of the few people to beat John J. Crittenden. He winds up becoming Speaker of the House. President James Madison said, this man, Solomon P. Sharp, has the most brilliant mind, one of the greatest minds of anyone west of the Allegheny Mountains. Who knows what he might have been, governor, maybe even president, had it not been for his relationship with this woman. Well, back down in Bowling Green, reading the newspapers and watching him climb to fame was Ann Cook. She lost that baby during her first stage of pregnancy, so the baby never made it. But she still kept her feelings of revenge that she would like to reap upon Solomon P. Sharp. There was another attorney down in Bowling Green area. His name was Jeroboam Beecham. And Jeroboam Beecham basically said to her, what would it take to get you to marry me? And she looked him straight in the eye and she said, I'll marry you if you'll kill Solomon P. Sharp. Well, all right, I'll do it. Well, they get married and some time goes by, and Ann says to Jerry, you know, I fulfilled my end of the bargain. You got what you wanted. Now it's time for you to come up with what I want. So he said, all right, I'll do it. So in November of 1825, he comes to Frankfort, Kentucky, to this house, the home of Solomon P. Sharp, about 2 o'clock in the morning, knocks on the door. Mr. Sharp comes with his candle in his night clothes to the door and answers it, and then Jeroboam Beecham stabs him in the stomach, trips it up there, and Sharp falls to the floor in a pool of blood and dies. Well, they had a little bit of trouble determining who actually committed this crime, but when they finally realized who it was, they sent to Bowling Green and arrested not only Jeroboam Beecham, but his wife, Ann, as well. And they brought them back to Frankfort, Kentucky, and lodged them in the dungeon of the jail. And that was located on the other side of the old Capitol building, over where the St. John AME Church today is located. So they're there in the dungeon, and Ann, realizing that they're going to die because they're going to have a trial and everything, but they're going to be hanged, so she says to her husband, let's beat the hangman. I just happen to have some laudanum, some poison with me, so we'll take this poison. Here, Jerry, take a big swallow. So he takes a big swallow, she takes a swallow, and they wait. But nothing happens. Apparently they were so ornery the poison couldn't even affect them. Time goes on, the story gets bigger. People all over the country are trying to find out what's going to happen in this case about Solomon P. Sharp. Well, she somehow gets a hold of a knife, a kitchen knife. So she says, what we'll do is we'll stab ourselves. So she said, here, Jerry, stab yourself. Well, Jerry still remembered, you know, stabbing Solomon P. Sharp and watching the agony on that man's face when he died. So he didn't stab himself very, very hard. He did draw blood and everything, but she really gave herself a number, and she died. When the authorities found her dead and him bleeding, they immediately said, let's just hang him anyway. Let's go. So they took him out to the gallows, which at that time was where our Frankfort Cemetery is located, up by Glens Creek Road in East Maine, and they hung him with him bleeding profusely. But that's not the end of the story. It seems that Ann and Jeroboam wanted to be buried together in the same coffin. So over in Bloomfield, Kentucky, they're buried in the Maple Grove Cemetery in the same grave. She wrote the epitaph, and it was scripted out on a huge concrete slab. And over the years, the slab is broken in half, and it's become weathered and everything. And it's pretty difficult to read the actual words, but someone in the last 10 years or so has put together a new monument that's there next to the grave where you can really read very plainly her epitaph. Well, the story was so big that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a piece based on this crime here in Frankfort, Kentucky. If you have a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's stories and tales, you have a copy of it. It's called Polition, and it's written in verse form, and it's a play. Now, he didn't really use the whole story of Solomon P. Sharp and the other two, but what he used was the idea of a suicide compact, and you can make that out when you read the story. This was a worldwide story in 1825 and 1826. In fact, there was another book by Robert Penn Warren that came out in the 1950s called World Enough and Time. He changed the name of the major people involved, but its beautiful history of Frankfort in 1825 is absolutely incredible. He did a marvelous job of reconstructing our town to the point where it's just very vivid the way he constructed his book. World Enough and Time. It's available in your local bookstores. Now, across the street at 333 Broadway is the law offices, down there next to the two cars, between the two cars, is the law offices of George Mortimer Bibb. George Mortimer Bibb was probably the most famous jurist of his day. He was so famous that if you were an aspiring attorney and went to classes under him and was tutelaged by him, you would probably have your choice of any particular law firm you'd like to get involved with, because he was so good. He went on to become the Secretary of Treasury of the United States under President John Tyler. And he was the last congressman to wear this funny-looking clothes that I have on. He wore these tights and these short pants and everything, which are pretty practical if you stop to think about it. They didn't have air conditioning back in those days, so consequently, wearing the short pants made it a little cooler for them, and then with the tights, it kept the dirt off of them as well. It's hard for us to realize the condition of travel and roads back in the early days, but the roads were either very dusty or very muddy. There was no in between, and you talk about potholes. There were some tremendous potholes. In fact, the reason we have all these little towns between the big towns like Louisville, Middletown, Shelbyville, Clay Village, on down here to Bridgeport, to Frankfort, to Midway, to Lexington, that was about the distance that you could travel during the daytime on a stagecoach. It was just a few miles, 12 to 15 miles at the most, that you could make any time on. Very few people would travel at night because of the condition of the roads and also because of robbers. So wearing clothes like this was very practical. Unfortunately, the women, they wore those big fancy dresses that seemed to me to be excessively hot. Our friend there at the lawyer's office, Mr. George Mortimer Bibb, he had a little brother whose name was John. And John wasn't very famous at all. He had been in the legislature and been in the War of 1812, but today he is more well known than his famous brother was. In fact, I venture to say that most of the folks in our audience have never heard of George Mortimer Bibb, but John Bibb we have heard about. And we'll talk more about that when we get to John's house. Let's focus our attention over here on the corner of Washington and Broadway to the parking lot. It reminds me of that parking lot of a song that Joni Mitchell had, Pave Paradise, Put Up a Parking Lot, because that's what happened way, way back here in Frankfort, Kentucky. That was the home of Francis Preston Blair, and he worked with a fellow down the street whose name was Amos Kendall in that big white building across from the tracks that has the black gabled roof. Amos Kendall lived there. Amos Kendall had a newspaper, and this newspaper was so popular that Andrew Jackson said, I want you to come to Washington to start a newspaper on my behalf. And you remember, this is in the days before CNN and NBC and WFKY. So politicians specifically would like to have newspapers. That way they could say anything they wanted to, and they also didn't have to put any of their competitors' comments in their papers. Well, Jackson liked our friend down the street here and his way of writing, Amos Kendall. So Amos leaves Frankfort, goes to Washington, D.C., and is creating the newspaper when he gets another job for Andrew Jackson, and that's Postmaster General of the United States. Well, he realizes he can't do the job at all because he's got this newspaper. So he says, look, Andy, isn't it possible that maybe I could get a friend of mine to come and take over the newspaper end, and I'll do the Postmaster General work? He said, sure, whatever you think to get the job done. So he does that. Francis Preston Blair leaves Frankfort, Kentucky, takes his family, they go to Washington, and they get involved with a residence which is right across the street from the White House. It's today known as the Blair House. And of course, that's the house where all the famous dignitaries stay when the president has guests and visitors, in the Blair House. So we had the original Blair House. It was right here, but it's not with us today. It's gone. Across the street where our local Red Cross is located, that originally was the home of the daughter of Governor John Adair, Catherine, and her husband, John Foster. He was with the Kentucky Registrar's office. These houses have a way of outliving those who dwell in them. Over the years, another family lived there. Originally, the front door was located on the Broadway side. The man didn't like that because when he had his horses tied up to the front of the house, the trains going by on the railroad tracks would disturb his horses. So he opened up the front, built that doorway there that you see, and used that for access. This house across the street by Herod Brothers Funeral Home was the home of Thomas Landon. He was not a governor, he was an attorney, and he was a politician involved with the legislature, but his sister is perhaps more famous than him, Emily Thomas Tubman. She married a fellow down in Georgia. He was a planter down there, and he was pretty wealthy. And when he died, she inherited all of his money. So she became a benefactress. She would come back to her hometown of Frankfort, and she would take her money and put it into the Midway Girls' School, or in one instance, she became an emancipationist. Now, these were folks who believed that the slaves should have an opportunity to go back to Africa. Many of those slaves remembered their homes, had been just brought over, so consequently, she paid for some great number of families, about 65 to 70 families, to go to Africa out of her own pocket. And when she found out that some of them did not like being over in Africa and would rather be back in the United States, she paid for their passage to come back to the United States. She's a very gracious lady. When the first Christian church had a devastating fire that destroyed their sanctuary, out of her own pocket, she rebuilt the sanctuary, some $20,000 plus, so that the church could continue to have worship services. Now, this church building here, Church of the Ascension, was also a gift. This was a gift from John Harris Hanna. John Harris Hanna was the first president of the Farmers Bank and Capital Trust Company. He was one of the prime movers and groovers and shakers of our community. His wife, in her letters, have said that she thought her husband was a workaholic because when he came home from work after supper, he would go right into his office at home and continue dabbling in his books and in his business. Well, he wanted to help out the Church of the Ascension. This church, when it got started, had only a few members, and they never seemed really to have enough money to make anything happen. They were given $1,000 by the Church of the Ascension in Greenwich Village, New York City, a church which still stands there today. And with the $1,000, they built a church building over in the vicinity of where that Christmas tree is located. And that's where they worshiped for many years. John Harris Hanna, he went over to Europe to look over designs and came up with this great concept for this Gothic style building. Originally there used to be a steeple, but in the 1930s an electrical thunderstorm took it out, and they decided they just wouldn't put it back up. So we just have that the style of the building there. He was a very busy fellow, but we sometimes wonder if he really used his own money to buy this building for the church. His wife just happened to be the daughter of Kentucky's first millionaire, John Hunt of Lexington, Kentucky. She was an aunt of John Hunt Morgan of Civil War fame, and her daddy died the same time this church was built. So it's possible that her husband may have taken some of her money to build this beautiful church. We'll never know. It's just one of those stories that hang out there. Across the street at 308 Washington was the home of Benjamin Cave Milam and his son John. They were involved with the fishing reel business. They eventually matched up with a group of brothers, the Meek brothers, and combined their talents to have the Meek Milam reel. And after Benjamin Cave Milam bought the Meeks out, it was just the Milam reel, which is still available today. We're talking about over 100 years. In fact, presidents of the United States would send to little old Frankfort, Kentucky to get their fishing reels. The Kentucky Historical Society has one of the Milam reels on display that you can see. There's also one on display in Frankfort's newest museum. That is the Kentucky River Authority Museum, located on Broadway. I believe it's 407 Broadway. And here's an opportunity for you to get the history of the Kentucky River, especially how it has affected Frankfort, Kentucky. There's a one on display there as well. Now this house over here on the corner was the home of Jacob Swigert. Jacob Swigert was much like John Harris Hanna. He was a politician, a lawyer, a businessman. If there was a dollar to be made, this man was involved in that particular effort. He was working with the road company. He was with the railroad company. He also was involved in the water company. They took and developed a 25-foot retaining wall out at Cedar Cove, that's behind the Montessori School, and they created a reservoir up at Cedar Cove. They took the cedar logs, hewed them out, and fused them together, much like straws, and by gravity brought water from the reservoir down to this part of Frankfort, Kentucky. So you could go to a well and get fresh water. Man was pretty much a genius. He was involved in the railroad company too, and he had a woolen company. And this is what they produced, jeans. This material is more like what the original jeans were like, and not so much the denim style that we're so familiar with today. But he had a little problem. During the Civil War, Frankfort was taken over by the Confederates. And when they took over the town, they went down to his woolen factory and bought all of his available material for jeans. It's almost $70,000 worth of material. Of course, they paid in Confederate money, which was basically worthless. So not every business venture was a successful one for Mr. Swigert. Now, there's been others that have lived in this house as well. Colonel E.H. Taylor lived here. He was of the old Taylor whiskey fame. Now, this building that you see here now is a beautiful example of a country townhouse. The walls are 2 feet thick, keeping the heat in the wintertime and the heat out in the summertime. It's a beautiful house, and many, many people have lived here. It was built around 1810. John Harvey, a Virginia planter, lived here. He was a good friend of Henry Clay, the famous statesman from Lexington. And whenever Henry Clay was a representative to the legislature here in Frankfort, he would stay here in this building with John Harvey, instead of trying to go back to Lexington, Kentucky, to his home, Ashland. Remember I told you about the conditions of the roads. It isn't like you just hop in the car and a half hour you're back into Lexington. It would be more like a whole day's ride just to get to Lexington, Kentucky. Another fellow that lived here was Charles Slaughter Moorhead. He was the governor of Kentucky, and he loved Franklin County so much because of their support they gave him during his election, that he named one of his children Franklin. He's buried up in the Frankfort Cemetery with his family, not far from Daniel Boone's grave. In fact, as you're looking at Daniel Boone's grave, just down the hill on the left is this huge monument that the state put up in honor of Charles Slaughter Moorhead. And then there's the stones for his own family, and there's one there for Franklin County. This big, beautiful home nowadays has been restored and renovated by Bill Johnson, one of the leading defense attorneys here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And for those of you that would like to see the interior, to see some of the fireplaces that are original and the staircase, and upstairs perhaps if you talk just right to Big Bill, you might get a chance to see some of the hog hair and horsehair plaster work that's on display up there from way back in the early 1800s when this building was built. You can see indeed how beautiful it is, and it's a marvelous structure. Back in the old days, these houses were sort of self-sufficient. They would have their own livery at the back of the house where they would keep their horses and their wagons, and they also had gardens that would stretch for a distance behind their house. That way they could have vegetables for their regular meals. Nowadays, the livery's a little different in the back. The horses are not quite the same. The horses are a different nature, as you can see, as well. And if you also can get a good example to see the back of this building here, you see where there at one time was a porch that's been taken down. Mr. Johnson wanted to make this look as much as at all possible like it originally did. Others that lived here included a fellow who was involved, Mr. Tobin, with the railroads. And then we had a Miss Kentucky that lived here at one time in the 50s, 1950s, and in the early 60s. She was a cousin of mine, believe it or not. Her beauty, of course, did not wear off onto me. Well, let's cross the street. We'll see the home of John Goodman. Not to be confused with John Goodman, the actor on the Roseanne Barr TV series, but John Goodman, the musician. Every little town had a musician. This is the man that you would send your children to if you wanted them to learn how to play the violin, or if you would like to have a piano made, he would construct one for you. He was quite a man, John Goodman. Now, as you take a close look at this building, you'll see it's in very poor shape. In fact, next door is the old State Journal newspaper building, and when they moved out off of Wilkinson Boulevard, they sold their property to Fiscal Court of Franklin County. The idea for Fiscal Court was to put the family court here, which they have done, and then tear this building down and make a big parking lot behind it. But we urge the judge and also the magistrates, through people such as yourself, to talk with them and see if we couldn't save the building. So actually what they've done, they did tear down some of the building in the rear, and they put up a freshly blacktop parking lot area, but we don't know what the future of this building is going to be. As you can see, it would take quite a bit of money to put it back together again to be serviceable. It's not a very big building, so there's not much use you could get out of it. So hopefully, anyway, I'm hoping that the court will find a way to maybe just keep the facade if they have to destroy the back section of the building. All that remains to be seen. Stay tuned. This Civil War was going on, and they needed people. He got into Annapolis when he was only 14 years old. A fellow across the street, John J. Crittenden, recommended him for the position, and he went on to fame later as being one of the first white people to explore the Amazon and the Orinoco rivers down in South America. One of the beautiful things about this building is the nice fan light that you see there that's projected. And also, if you look across the street, you'll see in the old slaughterhouse there, you'll see, it's not a slaughterhouse, but that's where Governor Slaughter lived. You'll see that fan window up at the top there in the attic. And you also can get a feel for the smartness of the builders to create as many windows as they could in that building to soak up the afternoon sun. We're getting a picture of that now. If that tree wasn't there, you would have the sun shining in those windows, and that would give them light until the sun would go down, and of course it would be dark. You'd have to resort to candles. And again, as we mentioned earlier, fire was very devastating to all of our towns. In fact, fire is still devastating to our towns. If you'll take a look down on the corner of the alley in Main Street, you can see the burned out building there of the Governor Owsley house. Governor Owsley married one of his students. He was a school teacher. When he ran for governor, they tried to make an issue of that, but it really didn't seem to bother him too much because he obviously was elected. But that was a fire that happened a couple of years ago, and they're trying to reconstruct it, put it back on its feet. Right now it's in pretty good shape, but they're looking for a buyer. So if anyone out there is interested in a beautiful building, here's a chance to get the Owsley house. Now across the street and behind me is the home of one of our greatest politicians, one of our greatest statesmen, John Jordan Crittenden. He was born in a log cabin over in Woodford County, just outside of Versailles. It's still there on US 60. It's been reassembled and moved to another part, but it's still there. He was born in the late 1700s. And he became an attorney, first of all serving over in Versailles, then later moving to Russellville, Kentucky for a time. He got involved in the legislature and came back to Frankfort and fell in love with this town, realizing that since we'd become a state, there were a lot of boundary disputes and a lot of problems. People back in the early days, instead of going to the courthouse and registering their property and getting a deed surveyed, they just went by, well, that big black stone down there and that sycamore tree, and over here, that's our land. Well, that didn't count anymore when we became a state. So it was a field day for many attorneys because they were the ones that had to process all of this. So he came here, and in 1819, he bought this house. This house was built around 1800. This is a house that kind of is reminiscent of the colonial style that you'll see in Philadelphia. John J. Crittenden, in his service to his state and his country, served as governor of Kentucky. He was 5 times United States Senator. He was twice United States Attorney General. Very, very busy man. He had a rather large family. He married 3 different times, his wives dying, and they also brought children from previous marriages as well, so he had quite a household in this home. One of his daughters, and it's interesting that this window is open here just a bit, folks, because one of his daughters wrote a biography of her daddy, and she talked about being on the other side of those windows, listening to her father out here talking to the trees. He would be touching the leaves and touching the tree. In reality, what he was doing was rehearsing his political speeches. But to a little girl, she thought her daddy was talking to the trees. So it wound up being a nice little story. John J. Crittenden had among his children 2 boys that served during the Civil War. One was a general for the North, another was a general for the South. So you can imagine the angst that this family went through during the war. In fact, he died in 1863. So he died never knowing if his boys made it or if we remained loyal to the Union or what. He wrote the Crittenden Compromise, which was designed to stave off the Civil War, but Lincoln and his people chose not to accept that, and we went through the bloody war. The federal soldier, Thomas Leonidas Crittenden, also lived here in Frankfort too, and he had a son, John Jordan Crittenden III. Now this boy was killed with George Armstrong Custer at the Little Bighorn out in Montana in 1876. When he was a young boy, just before he went west, he had been in a hunting accident and he lost the use of his eye. He had to go to Cincinnati for surgery, and they put a glass eye in his socket. Well, when he was ready to go into service, his daddy gave him a watch. It was a watch that he had gotten when he was the consul to Liverpool over in England. He had bought this watch over there. It had his name engraved in it and also had Liverpool, England in it. And he gave this watch later to his son with the idea that he would be on time and loyal to his cause and would not be late for anything that he had to do. So his son carried the watch that his daddy gave him into that battle with Custer. Well, at the end of the day, when over 250 of Custer's men were dead, the Indians, for the most part, stripped the bodies of their clothing. They also would hack off the arms, heads, genitals of the bodies. We consider that to be an atrocity. The Indians saw it a little differently. They thought, in their thinking, that when I die and go into the happy hunting ground, I have to face my enemy again. So if you could take out your enemy ahead of time by cutting off his arms and legs and his manhood, then you wouldn't really have a very tough enemy to face later on. But when they got to the body of John J. Crittenden III, there was that glass eye staring at them. So they gave him a little extra treatment. They didn't seem to bother his body as much as they bothered the others. But they did take the watch. One of the Indians heard the ticking of the watch and was quite impressed by that. And he kept it, and it was very nice, a silver trinket. You could hear it tick, 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 tick. But then as the week went on, the watch ran down, and it no longer ticked. So to the Indian, it was worthless. So he winds up trading it to a trader in Canada. The trader has it for a time, and he starts looking at it and reading the names that are inside and realizes that, hey, this belonged to Thomas Leonidas Crittenden. The President of the United States at that time was Ulysses S. Grant, who was a friend of Tom Crittenden's. They'd worked together during the war. So the trader up in Canada sends the watch to the President of the United States. When Grant gets it, he realizes exactly who this belongs to and sends it to Frankfort, Kentucky, to Thomas Leonidas Crittenden. And of course, he's so glad to get the watch back. So here we have this watch that went from Liverpool, England, to the battlefield out in Montana, to Canada, to the President of the United States, back to Frankfort, and it's still here in Frankfort. You can see it at the Kentucky History Center. They have it on display there. There were a lot of guests that came to this house, and everybody that came here had to walk on this. This was used as a coach step. Remember, we talked about the rough conditions of the road and the dust and the mud. Mr. Crittenden and his family would come up in their wagon, get out, step onto this, and go into their home. This was given to the Crittendens by the legislature. This was part of one of the former state capitals that we told you about that had burned to the ground. Among those that have been here are Daniel Webster and his family, who came to visit, and Zachary Taylor, President of the United States. He was on his way to Washington to be inaugurated when he stopped here for a visit with Crittenden, who was governor of Kentucky at the time. He wanted Crittenden to become his Secretary of State, but as it turned out, he said, no, I'll continue to serve the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He later would go on and get involved with more government positions. John J. Crittenden, marvelous man. Across the street, this was the house, you remember we talked about, was the home of Jacob Swigert. Well, if you'll notice, the stone work there at the bottom of the house, that foundation, that was the original house that stood there. Originally, the first house was just one floor with the 2 rooms on each side and 2 on behind. When Mr. Swigert bought the property, he added on the front part that you see over there. You can actually see the line where they're connected and the way the foundation is different. And he added on the rest of the house, and then years later, they added the part that extends on down toward the church. This originally was the home of Dr. Preston Brown. He was a brother to John Brown of Liberty Hall fame. Here you'll see behind me another one of the porticos from one of those old Capitol buildings that burned to the ground, and this was a gift given to the Crittendens. Now this part of the building here was added on much later after Crittenden had died. The Crittenden house itself goes to the drain pipe that you see there. That is the original building. The other was added on through the years. Now we're approaching a beautiful home here that kind of gives us the feel of New Orleans. James Wilkinson, the founder of our town, when he got the idea of making Frankfort a trade base, he wanted to take flatboats with Kentucky goods, tobacco, whiskey, and other items that we made here in Kentucky, put them on the flatboats, take them down the Kentucky River to the Ohio River, down to the Mississippi to New Orleans, and sell them to the Spanish. A great idea, wonderful idea. Only problem was it was illegal. We had just finished the Revolutionary War. Spain was at war with England. We certainly didn't want to get into that. Spain owned the rights to the Mississippi River. So consequently, no Kentuckians were permitted to use the Mississippi River. Well, our friend Mr. Wilkinson, the founder of Frankfort, did it anyway. He took a flatboat down with goods and sold about $6,000 worth of items, and they made quite a bit of money. And he also made a deal with the Spanish government down there as well. A man by the name of Governor Miro, M-I-R-O. When Wilkinson named the streets, he named Miro Street M-I-R-O. Today it's M-E-R-O. He made an under-the-table deal with the Spanish government that for $2,000 a year, he would continue to try to bring more business to New Orleans, breaking the law, obviously, that the United States had set up. Mr. Wilkinson, unfortunately, folks, was somewhat of a crook. In fact, his nickname was Silky Wilkie. He was born in 1757 in Maryland, and his daddy died while he was just a little boy. So his mother said, "Son, you've got to get a good education because I'm not going to be able to help you when you grow up." So he decided he'd either be a lawyer or a doctor. He wound up with the idea of being a doctor. So he went to Philadelphia for his schooling, and at the time he arrived there, that's when the Revolutionary War was beginning to get underway. So he joins and becomes a private. He just happens to be at the right place at the right time. He meets a guy named George Washington, who for some reason liked him and just sort of escalated him right on through the war. He was in a lot of very important battles, Ticonderoga, Princeton, and some of the others. He just seemed to be with the right people at the right time. But he always manipulated and used every situation for his own personal gain. It was James Wilkinson that had his friends, after the Revolutionary was over, the war, come to Frankfort and lay off the streets. They raised the ground over there where the present old Capitol building is located. They cleaned up the swampiness and got rid of it, ditched and drained, made the streets, and built a couple of log cabins in our town, of which we'll talk about later on. This house here was the home of Judge James Hazelrig. He was called away from his supper in 1900 to go down to the old Capitol Hotel, which is today's State National Bank building area. That's the site of it, to swear into office Governor Goebel on his deathbed. So he does so, comes back home, finishes his supper. A couple of days later, he's called away from supper again to swear in the lieutenant governor at the death of Goebel. Very, very interesting story. Down here on the corner at the alley is an old-time street marker. These street markers were here in the early 1900s, and this street marker right here on this corner says Petticoat Lane. Well, for a long time we wondered about the origin of that. You can almost guess and figure it out, but we don't like to guess when it comes to telling history. It turns out that on this site, not this building here, but on this site was the home of the Pepper family, who were distillers. And they had a daughter, little Susie, who used to go down this alley to visit with her friend Patty Burnley. And because of the condition of the streets, remember, real dusty or real muddy, they would hike their petticoats up and walk down, and they'd hike their skirts up, and you could see their petticoats. This is all that's referred to as Petticoat Lane. Has another name across the street on the other side. We'll talk more about Patty Burnley shortly. The Presbyterian Church, you see here, was built about 1849, the same time when Zachary Taylor was here to see John J. Crittenden about him coming to be his Secretary of State. This is the church where John J. Crittenden attended. So John J. invites Zachary Taylor to go to church with him that Sunday. It was one of the first services held in this building. So the people of the community made a huge platform here for the president-elect and also for the governor of Kentucky, and they greeted the people as they arrived for church on that Sunday. One of the pastors of this church was B.J. Lacey, and during the Civil War, he, of course, was a Southern persuasion, so they fired him. So he left Frankfort and went south and got hooked up with a man called Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was a very ardent Presbyterian, a man of God who was a true Christian, who believed that God had ordained him for his position. And that's why he wasn't afraid during the battles to be right out in front. In fact, it would later cost him his life. It seems that his own men, by mistake, fired upon him and shot him, and they had to amputate his arm, and he eventually would die. That arm that was amputated was buried by the preacher at this church, B.J. Lacey. Lacey was given the chore of continuing church services for Stonewall Jackson during the war. He had church services over at on Wednesday night, and he would have church services on Sunday. Obviously, if they were in battle, they would not have that. Another preacher, I might say, that was with this church was Jesse Ziegler. Jesse Ziegler, on his way to Europe on a boat, happened to run into a man who was a very famous architect. You want to take a guess who we're talking about here? The famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. And they became good friends while on the boat. And he had told him that I'm getting ready to build a house, so Frank Lloyd Wright designed the house for him, which you can see today over on Shelby Street. Very fascinating. Across the street, another law firm, Stites and Harbison, have saved this building for us. It was a distiller's home. The LeBreau family lived there for a time, and some of the Taylors there as well. LeBreau was a Frenchman who came to Kentucky from France with the idea of operating a winery, but he couldn't control the climate. So consequently, he got into the whiskey business. Today you can visit the LeBreau Graham Distillery over on the Woodford County, Franklin County line off of US 60 and see them with the big copper kettles making the whiskey, and I understand they have a fine restaurant there as well. The Civil War was very devastating to Franklin County. We were almost evenly divided. We had around 200 for each side, perhaps a little more, fighting for the South. This house across the street, the big red house on the corner, was the home of Thomas Leonidas Crittenden, the father of the boy that was killed with Custer. He was the federal general during the Civil War. He lived here for only about 4 or 5 years prior to the Civil War itself. This house is rather unique and interesting in that there's only about 2 other houses like this in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Underneath the clapboard is a style of building where it's called nogging. They have stone, rather rock and brick and wood underneath that, which gives it a very, very strong sturdiness to it. In the 70s, there was a movement to put a state office building here and tear this building down. But the concerned citizens of our town said they didn't want that to happen. Historic Frankfort came out of that, a local preservation group, and one that's still thriving today, and they saved the building for us. So we still have Crittenden's home. One of the Garrett family also lived here as well, who was one of the state leaders in our community. As I was saying about the Civil War, it was quite deadly. This little house right down here was the home of Mary Willis Todd. Mary Willis Todd, her husband had died. She had a young boy, Frank Todd, who wanted to fight. So he went and was fighting for the Federals down at Perryville, Kentucky. And in that battle, he lost his arm. So he was given an honorable discharge, and he came back to this house here in Frankfort with his mom, and he said, you know, Mom, I would love to, if at all possible, be back with my buddies. I just don't feel right sitting here. You think they'd take me even without an arm? She said, son, you do what you think's best. So he gets back in the Army. And his very next battle is he's in at Murfreesboro, the Battle of Stone River down in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He gets killed. In that same battle was another boy from Frankfort, Kentucky, who was fighting for the southern side. He was a flag bearer, and as you probably know, one of the first that you take out of the enemy is the one that carries the flag, because that kind of stops morale amongst the soldiers. And also, you don't know where you are if you don't know if you don't see your flag. Sometimes you can't tell who's who with all the smoke and everything and dust from the gunfire. Well, he was killed in that same battle at Stones River. Both of the boys are buried up in the Frankfort Cemetery. And what is unique is that the mother of the boy who lost his arm at Perryville and the father of the southern boy, a few years after the war, got married. And it's sort of like bringing the North and the South together again. If you'll notice, looking straight at the building where the American flag is located, and to the right, there's sort of an indentation there. Not that black mark above the door between the two windows, but right near the tip of the flag, there's this indentation. During the Civil War, in 1862, when the Confederates took over Frankfort, they not only took over the only capital that they took over during the war from the federal side, but they also inaugurated a southern governor at the same time. They ran up the flag there in front of the old Capitol and inaugurated a governor. The idea being to establish enough interest amongst the pro-Southern cause in Kentucky to get people to join. They thought, well, if you've got a governor and we make this a southern state, and Bowling Green will be the capital, you'll get people to join. Well, it never worked, so it really didn't matter. As soon as the inauguration was over, the Federals came in out of Louisville and ran them all off anyway. But nevertheless, in 1864, we had another encounter with the Civil War troops from the South. You see, when they built the fort in 1862, because of the town being taken over, it was a little embarrassing, you would think, for Abraham Lincoln, his own home state, to have the capital city taken over. Well, they decided they better build a fort. So they built Fort Hill, which of course you can visit through the City Parks and Recreation Department, and they had it manned. But then nothing ever happened. We had no more encounters until 1864, when the South pretty well knew that the war was over. Men like John Hunt Morgan and his raiders were just that. They became raiders. Instead of, honoring the situation and giving what they chose and picked up from others to the government, they were keeping it for themselves. They had been over to Mount Sterling and robbed the bank of quite a bit of money. They were going to come into Frankfort, Kentucky as well, sack the courthouse, the Capitol building, and the arsenal, taking whatever they could get. And of course, if that happened, it's possible that they might have moved the capital of Kentucky to Louisville. We don't know, but that's a possibility. But in 1864, when the Rebs came into Frankfort, it scared everybody. There wasn't any army here. We had a couple of soldiers that were on leave here in town, but for the most part, there wasn't anybody here at all to defend the city. So the two fellows that were in town, one of which was Daniel Lindsay, he gets together the townspeople, your teachers, your farmers, your jewelers, your grocers. They all go up on top of the hill there, Fort Hill, which you can see where the trees are. And they set up shop up there to defend the city. Now, back in those days, there wasn't a tree at all on the top of the hill, because when they built the fort in 1862, they cut down all of the trees so they could see and have good visibility. So you can almost imagine about 100 people up there. And this was not the kind of fort that you see in some of the Western movies where the Indians are coming in. This was an earthen fort, and it was one that was designed to protect the city. So these fellows who had never fired a cannon before in their lives did the best they could. Mrs. Brown, who lives over here in Liberty Hall, talks in some of her letters about the missiles and rockets going over top of her house. Well, they hit this house here. Fortunately, the canister didn't explode, and that's in that spot I was telling you about, right above the flag, is where that cannonball landed at the house. So it was really tough times here in Frankfort, Kentucky during the Civil War days, and we now kind of go to our granddaddy of all the beautiful homes built by John Brown in about 1796. His whole idea was to build this home for his mom and dad who were retiring. He was from Stanton, Virginia, and he came here into Kentucky as a lawyer and attorney and developed quite a position. When we became a state in 1792, he was one of our first senators. He and Jonathan Edwards of Bourbon County were our first two senators to Congress from Kentucky. He lived here and built this house. Well, before he could get his mom and dad into it and finish the house, he fell in love with a young lady, Margaretta Mason, and they get married and they decided this is going to be our home. So he puts his mom and dad up over in Versailles in Woodford County in a spot over there. And remember, the distance is pretty good, so you didn't have any surprise visits from mom and dad because you were about a day apart. This house, the bricks were built from the backyard. The property extends all the way to the Kentucky River and all the way down to Wapping Street. He was a very good friend of Thomas Jefferson. This house sort of has a Jeffersonian feel to it. In fact, some of our early histories of Frankfort, Franklin County say that Jefferson designed this building and visited here, but that's not true. He did not design it, nor did he ever visit what is known as Kentucky today. He did, in a letter, give some ideas to John Brown about how to build this, but by the time John Brown got the letter, he was already well into building this house, so he didn't go with his design. The palladium window that you see above the doorway in the middle of the house there, that's one of the beautiful features of this house. And of course you have another fan light at the very, very top. Those fan lights were important to let as much light into a home without having to use the candles. So that's the reason we have some of these beautiful homes built the way they're constructed. In 1819, President James Monroe came to Liberty Hall. He was visiting the United States troops, and when he got to Kentucky, he wanted to come here because John Brown's brother, James, not to be confused with James Brown, the soul singer, but James Brown had been the man who gave the Monroe Doctrine to the French government. So he was wanting to see John for that, and they were, of course, friends as well. With him coming to Liberty Hall were two aides, and those aides were Andrew Jackson and Zachary Taylor. So we had at one time three men who would be President of the United States. They had breakfast here that day and visited in a few other places as well. John was quite involved as a lawyer, an attorney, and as a businessman in our community. And his wife, they were very much beloved in our town. It was because of his stature that we had a lot of people want to settle in Frankfort, Kentucky. And he was a drawing card to this little community back when he built this house in 1796. He would die about 1837. He and his wife had several children, two boys of which lived for adulthood and maturity, Mason Brown and Orlando Brown, and several of their children would die. This is in the days before doctors knew what germs were. The doctors never washed their utensils, nor did they wash their hands after they performed births or whatever operations that they tried to do. And consequently, they ignorantly, not realizing, probably brought about the death of many people. A lot of babies died in childbirth, or children didn't make it in their early age. They lost several babies in their early stages. Then they had a girl named Euphemia. Euphemia made it through her childhood, but she only lived to be about between 7 and 10 years of age when she too would die. And when this happened, it just devastated John Brown and his wife. They were just out of sorts. In fact, they withdrew from the community. They quit being involved in local activities. He pretty much gave up his efforts involving politics and lawyers, and they just sort of moped along. When an aunt, Mrs. Varick, in New York City learned about the death of this child, Euphemia, she immediately came to Frankfort, Kentucky from New York to console her niece, Margaretta. And in the process, within a week or so, she too would die and was buried in the backyard. Well, over the years, this family has always lived in this house, the Browns and their descendants. When this house became a part of the colonial dames, it was the family that still lived here that donated it to them. So the only people that ever lived here have been from descendants of the Brown family. The caretakers from the 50s on up to today of this building on occasion have heard strange noises. They've seen doors that close by themselves, rocking chairs that rock by themselves, and voices, and the sounds of footsteps upstairs. In the 1960s, they had a fire in the central hall there of the house. Thank goodness it was not a devastating fire, but it was a fire that required them to do some painting and renovating. And when they were finished, they wanted to take pictures. And then when they got the film developed, they started looking. One of the pictures shows a woman coming down the staircase with her hand on the banister, and you can see right through her. She's called the Gray Ghost, the Gray Lady. Mrs. Varick? We don't know. In the early 1960s, when I first started working for the radio station and I heard about this story, I thought it would be a great opportunity on Halloween to come and spend the night at Liberty Hall with a microphone and be on the radio to see if I too could hear and see some of these strange things. But they didn't give me permission to do that. But over the years, A&E, the Learning Channel, other famous magazines have written about this story, and a lot of people that come here come because they want to see the ghost.
Lies! Don't believe a word of it! Not a molecule of proof in any of it!
For those of you that might have heard that was, excuse me, that was the curator of historic sites at Frankfort, Kentucky. Excuse me, he choked me up. Mickey Hughes. He on occasion does that to me. So anyway, we really don't know about the ghost, but if you want to see that photograph, you must request to see it, and they'll show it to you when you visit Liberty Hall. At this point, there's no charge to visit Liberty Hall. This is a beautiful, beautiful location. You'll see here this tree, this catalpa tree. This tree was here before the house was built. 100 years later, they took seedlings from the tree and planted the tree that's next to it. And then just this past year, 200 years later, descendants of the Brown family from California came here and planted another tree. And it's thriving and growing very well today. If you'll notice the old tree here that's over 200 years old, it's propped up by a stick over there. And as you go past it, you can see through the interior all the way to the other side. And yet it still produces its fruit. We always call them cigar trees, and you can see it as well, still growing today. Now the other tree you can best see as we get a little farther down. The gardens of Liberty Hall were the site of Frankfort's and Kentucky's first Sunday school. Margaretta Mason Brown and her friend down the street, Elizabeth Love, said if we can have Sunday school in New York City and in Philadelphia, excuse me, we can have Sunday school here in Frankfort. And so they would have classes, weather permitting, but it was only for the girls. And the girls would learn Sunday school verses, Bible verses, and things of this nature. Now, as we go by this other tree here, with your camera, David, you can get a shot of the current catalpa tree in all its radiant splendor and glory, growing now, looks like maybe 10, 15 feet. That's all since April of last year that it has grown. It's growing, like they say, like a weed. Liberty Hall. The property originally extended all the way down to the next corner. Now, across the street was the home of Harry Ennis Todd. That building is gone today. This is a more recent building. In the 1970s, we lost Harry Ennis Todd's house to fire. Some youngsters got in there in the wintertime, and nobody lived in the house, and they were going to try to get warm, and first thing you know, Fire got away from him. The building was destroyed. Harry Enniston was a boatman. He was a real big man, and he had a boat that he would be always hitting his head on or bumping his arms because he was so big. So he said he was going to build him a house that could accommodate his body. And he certainly did build a beautiful big home, the largest house in Frankfort. The house through the trees was built by John Brown for his son, Orlando Brown. Orlando was his youngest son behind Mason. Mason would inherit the Liberty Hall at the death of his father. Orlando was a newspaper man. He was pretty good at it too. Washington Irving said that had he spent most of his time writing, he might have made some great contributions. But he liked to explore. He became the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and had a few other jobs with the government over the years, but he was best known for his work on the newspaper. This was built in 1835 by Gideon Schrock, the same man who built our old Capitol building that we talked about earlier. This is believed to be his only residence that he built. Schrock also built the Jefferson County Courthouse. He built the old Transylvania, Old Morrison's Chapel in Lexington. He built the State House in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Bill Clinton was governor. So he got himself around quite a bit, built a lot of beautiful buildings. As you look through the trees over there to the porch that has the little windows across the street, you'll see the home of John Glover South. John Glover South was the ambassador to Panama. His wife was the daughter of Kentucky's first Republican governor, William Bradley. Another Republican governor had a connection to this house, and that was Governor Edwin Porch Morrow. He's the man who in 1920 signed into law in the Commonwealth of Kentucky the right for women to vote. He would later die in this house. He was related to Catherine, the daughter of the first Republican governor. So that's two Republicans involved in that house. And there's a third governor that was involved, another Republican. Simeon Willis lived in that house as well. So that's kind of an interesting home. If you're going to run for governor and you're a Republican, it might behoove you to get involved with that house. On this site, not the house that's here at the southwest corner of Wilkinson and Wapping, is holy ground. This is where James Wilkinson built his famous log house. It was a two-story log house. The building has been long since torn down, but it was right here on this corner. And he said to his wife, they had lived over in Lexington, he said, "Anne, this is going to be where we're going to live here in Frankfort." Well, there were only two cabins in town at the time. The streets were all laid out. He named Washington Street, obviously, for George, and Sinclair Street for Arthur Sinclair. Main Street was called Montgomery Street in those days for Richard Montgomery, who died at the Battle of Quebec. Everybody loved him. Mount Sterling, Montgomery County was named for him as well. He named Clinton Street for the governor of New York, later Vice President George Clinton. He named Miro Street for that Spanish general we talked about. And Ann Street that we have in town was named for his wife. So he says to Ann, "This is it, what do you think?" And she took a look and she says, "Jimmy, if you think I'm going to live in this two-house town, you got another thing coming." She went back to Lexington. Well, he eventually would go back too, selling this to Andrew Holmes, the man who engineered the $3,000 in cash and got for us the capital of Kentucky for Frankfort. He gave them this building to use for the legislature to meet in while they were building our Capitol buildings. So they met here as a legislature in the beginning of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And it proved to be later on a real nice location for an inn. This became the Love Tavern. Now we generally think of a tavern as a place to, do this. Actually, you can think of the tavern in those days as our modern motel. People would stay in these houses, have the various rooms to live in while they're visiting. And among those that visited here was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr, who was a pretty good shot, as you recall, from your days in history. Aaron Burr, after being Vice President of the United States, came to Frankfort, and the project he was working on at the time was to create a section down in Texas and Louisiana to create a new country of which he would be the emperor. James Wilkinson was in on that too, old Silky Wilkie. And he was here to get John Brown and others of this community to invest. He needed money to get an army together. He even got Andrew Jackson in on this as well. The very first trial for treason for Aaron Burr was held in Frankfort, Kentucky, and he got off. His lawyer was Big Bill Johnson. No, actually it was Henry Clay. Henry Clay. And of course Jefferson was quite upset when he found out that his friend Henry Clay had gotten off Aaron Burr, because Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson were not on too friendly basis at the time. When Jefferson was president, Aaron Burr was vice president under him. Well, anyway, he managed to get through that, and later on, Aaron Burr, of course, would be tried for treason. A lot of people don't realize this, but he was never found guilty. He had about 100 soldiers or more, and they were coming down the Mississippi River, getting ready to go to New Orleans to take over the town, and our friend Silky Wilkie had some misgivings. He said, you know, we don't have a very big army, and it's quite possible that he can be arrested, and I might go to jail too for being a complicity with this crime. So I think I'll arrest him and turn him over to the authorities. So Wilkinson arrests Aaron Burr and turns him in, thinking that he's covered his tracks. Well, he did pretty much. He got away with it. But when Aaron Burr was tried for treason, he was found not guilty because he never really did anything. They never fired a shot. So nothing ever really happened. They were stopped before they started. Another one of our guests at this spot was the King of France, Louis Philippe. He was in the United States in exile because back in France, they wanted to kill him so somebody else could become king. Well, he stayed here at the Love Tavern. And of course, everybody was excited about having the King of France here in Frankfort, Kentucky. They had a way that they could move the wall upstairs on the second floor and create a big dance floor. People love to have parties here in Kentucky. They still do. And so what they did was they had this big dance in honor of the King of France. So my friend the King asks Mrs. Love to dance with him, and she turns him down. Well, her neighbors were just absolutely dumbfounded that she would do such a thing. They were totally embarrassed. After the party was over, they came to Elizabeth and said, Lizzie, how could you turn down the King of France when he wanted to dance? She said, well, wait a minute, ladies. Just before he asked me to dance, my neighbor's son from down the street had asked me to dance. And I didn't feel like he was old enough. I thought he was too young. It might be improper for me to dance with him. And the very next person to ask me to dance was the King of France. And I thought, well, it would be rude of me to dance with the king if I wouldn't dance with my own neighbor's son. So consequently, she chose not to dance at all. She was a gracious lady, first lady to be buried in the Frankfort Cemetery. And as great and famous as she was in this town, she has one of the smallest tombstones in the Frankfort Cemetery. Elizabeth Love, little tiny words. They lived on this spot. Back there at the Brown House, Liberty Hall, we had an instance where Lafayette came to visit. He was fated here in, I guess, 1825. He was visiting all the cities of the United States after his work in the Revolutionary War, and now he was an old man. He was here with his secretary and his son, and he wanted to come down to Liberty Hall to see Margaret Mason because her daddy had been his chaplain during the war, and he had a lot of stories he wanted to tell her. Well, at the time when he came, they were in mourning over their daughter, and they didn't go out, and they didn't go to the big party, which was held at the site where the State National Bank is now located. So consequently, he left his own ball and walked down to Liberty Hall and visited with Mrs. Brown and told her the stories of her daddy. When we cross the street here, we're coming into the 1900s. If you will, follow the red brick wall all the way down past the fire hydrant, down to that tree and that white car, and you'll see how huge this property is. This was Vauxhall, the home of Graham Vreeland. He built this around 1910, 1913. He was the editor of the Frankfort State Journal. So our State Journal newspaper's been around a long time, thanks to this man. This house is very unique. In fact, it's on the market if you would like to purchase it. It's for sale. Another person who lived here was Judge Henry Meigs. This is a beautiful house, more of this century than the others we've been talking about. Now, right here behind me is a ginkgo tree. This ginkgo tree, somebody went through Frankfort, Kentucky and planted these all over town. They're in the cemetery. They're all over South Frankfort. Who knows? You may have one on your street somewhere, folks. In November, these leaves will turn a beautiful bright yellow. The texture of the leaves will be somewhat like velvet. They don't have an odor, there's no smell, but they do keep, and they're very bright and golden color and yellowish gold, and they make a real nice display in your house in the drab times of winter because of their beauty. This is a male tree. The female ginkgo has a horrible odor, and it's one of those smells you do not want to have around. So the fellow that came through and planted all of them never planted any female trees. You have only the male trees to reckon with. Now, you remember the story we told about George Mortimer Bibb, how famous he was in his lifetime, the famous jurist who was the Secretary of Treasury under John Tyler and the last to wear clothes such as this? Well, we're now approaching his house of his brother. This is John Bibb's house, Gray Gables. John Bibb, who, as we said earlier, just only had what you'd call a minor position in town. He was a lawyer, he had been serving as a legislator, and he also had been in the War of 1812, but he really would rather get and putter around in his backyard. So in the backyard of this beautiful old building here, he did gardening. And he came up with a strain of lettuce that is on the menus of a lot of our more famous restaurants throughout the country and the world, Bibb lettuce. So he is famous today and remembered, whereas his then famous brother is no longer even considered. This is where Patty Burnley lived. She was his niece. She never married. She was a spinster. She was quite proud of the fact that no one ever knew her age. Unfortunately, when she died and was buried in the Frankfort Cemetery, they put her birth date and her death date on the tombstone. So now we all know how old she is. She loved the arts. If you were a singer, a poet, a writer, if you were a musician, you were welcome to come to this house to dine and to enjoy. Some of those that had visited at this home and visited her was John Fox Jr., who wrote The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come, The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. He was Kentucky's first million-selling author. In fact, people that had never been in Kentucky thought that all Kentuckians were like the characters in his books. He wrote of the eastern Kentucky mountains, and he used great dialect up there over yon way and things like that. And the people that read the books thought that all Kentuckians talked this way. So this is part of the reasoning for our hillbilly image in a lot of people's minds in the world. I think that all Kentuckians were like that. They also can look at the killing of a governor as a reason that we might be kind of wild and ornery, and all those feuds that we had down in the mountain parts of the country as well. Another writer who was here was Robert Burns Wilson. He was better known as a painter. Some of his paintings are on display over there at the Orlando Brown House that we passed a moment ago. Robert Burns Wilson in 1898 heard about an explosion in the Havana harbor. The battleship Maine was destroyed. So he sat down over on Clinton and Ann Street at a house that still stands today and wrote a poem called Remember, Remember the Maine. Within a week, it was on the front page of the New York newspapers. Government saw it, the United States government, and made it the battle hymn of the Spanish-American War. Remember, remember the Maine. Quite a bit of money because it was copper. So consequently, they spent a lot of money to make that one go. Across the street is the Rodman Hewitt home. Rodman was a admiral during the United States World War I. He was commander of the Pacific Fleet. Another fellow that lived in that house was Fayette Hewitt. He was a Confederate general during the Civil War, and he had 3 horses shot out from under him. He wound up dying in this house. He fell in the bathroom, hit his head, and passed away. He was buried in Elizabethtown, his hometown. He was president of the State National Bank. This beautiful little garden you see here is a memorial garden to Ida Lee Willis. David, there's a plaque over there with some information about Ida Lee Willis. She was the wife of Simeon Willis, our Republican governor. When she found out some businessmen from Louisville were going to take this building down right here and put up a state office building, she went to Ned Breathitt, who was governor at the time, and she said, Ned, she could call him by his first name since she was a first lady. She said, Ned, we got to do something about this. We can't let people continue to take these beautiful homes, destroy them, and put up different edifices. He agreed with her. They created the Capitol Heritage Commission, which later became the Kentucky Heritage Commission, whose mission basically is to preserve the past. In other words, there's so much red tape you have to go through now if you want to take out one of these buildings that you'll probably die before you could ever get it happen or get it through. So what was the significance of this beautiful old home other than its beauty itself? Well, one of the people that lived here was Senator Graham Vest. Graham Vest found his fame in Missouri. Now, he lived as a little boy in Frankfort, Kentucky. He was born on the other side of the river where the old YMCA is located there by the bridge. But as a little boy, he grew up in this house. His fame would come later in Missouri when he became an attorney and a senator. One of the cases that he covered was about a dog who had been killed by a next-door neighbor. And in the process of his summation, he used the phrase, dog is man's best friend. And that phrase, of course, has lived on forever. There was a film recently out in the year 2001, Cats and Dogs. If you saw that, you heard that phrase milked to death, literally. The other fellow that lived here was Daniel Lindsay, and he was the soldier, one of the soldiers we talked about during the Civil War that helped save the town in 1864 when Morgan's Raiders came through. Across the street at 400 Wilkinson Street was the home of Robert Perkins Letcher. He was governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He was a very humorous fellow. In fact, he would carry on his campaigns to run for office a jug of whiskey in one hand and a fiddle in the other. He'd pass the jug around and do a little fiddling, and he would get elected. He only lost one race, and that was his last race. He was on the board that came up with the idea of creating a cemetery here in the capital city. The idea being, Mason Brown's the guy that really put it together, if we built a cemetery and put famous people in it, former governors that had passed on, if we'd fill it with famous people, people would come from far and wide to visit our town. Let's get Daniel Boone. So they did. Well, he was among those that helped make that happen, and that occurred in the 1840s, 1845 to 1850, when they incorporated our cemetery, the second cemetery in the United States incorporated, the first being Mount Auburn in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, across the street, the beautiful house there with the gingerbread and the gables and everything was the home of Justice Thomas Todd. Thomas Todd was a little boy when the Revolutionary War started out. He was an orphan. His mother and father had died, so he lied about his age, got into the Revolutionary Army, and sort of got in with a bunch of people that really appreciated this little kid who was so saucy and everything. And when the war was over, they brought him with them to Kentucky. And he literally grew up in a political atmosphere and got involved in politics. Later would be appointed by Thomas Jefferson as the Supreme Court Justice of the United States. And while he was in Washington, D.C., he fell in love with a gal who just happened to be the sister of Dolly Madison, the wife of President James Madison. So they got married in the White House. The first wedding in the White House was this man who lived here in Frankfort, Kentucky, Justice Thomas Todd. In all fairness about the house, when he lived here, it didn't have the gabled roofs nor the upper level. It was just a single floor dwelling, and it did not have the gingerbread work you see on the porch there, but it did have the fan lights above the door and to the side of the door. Behind me, over here on the other side, of course, is the Kentucky River, and this is the Federal Building, today known as the Paul Sawyer Library. The Federal Building was built in the late 1880s. It's over 100 years old now, and this is where we had our federal courts and trials on the second floor. The first floor was the post office. In the 1960s, it became the Paul Sawyer Public Library. It was named for Frankfort's famous artist, Paul Sawyer, who was born in Madison County, Ohio. His parents were from here in Frankfort, the Wingates and the Sawyers, and they lived right across from the train depot in downtown Frankfort, where the History Center is now located. Well, Paul knew, because he wanted to be a painter, that he couldn't have a family. He had a girlfriend, Mamie Bull, who lived over in South Frankfort, just across the river, and he told her basically that, you know, we'll never be able to have a marriage and have children because I love to paint so much and I'll never make enough money in order to provide for a family. So they never married. Paul Sawyer painted so many pictures of Frankfort, the covered bridge. He painted many areas here in downtown Frankfort. He lived on the river for a time and painted all up and down the Frankfort, Kentucky River, as well as Elkhorn Creek. He went all the way down to Shaker Landing, to where High Bridge is located, and did paintings down there as well. He would literally paint to eat. That's how he would survive and live. His daddy apparently contracted what we call today Alzheimer's, and his mother needed him to come home and help take care of the father. On occasion, he would step across from the house and get on a train there and maybe wind up in Chicago or wind up in Cincinnati, and he wouldn't know where he was or how to get home. And so Paul wound up coming back, and he and his mom lived behind the First Baptist Church here in a little chapel parsonage house that was behind the church, and they let him live there basically rent-free. And then, of course, his daddy passed on, and so did his mom, and he wound up leaving Frankfort, going to New York, where he would die in his early 50s. His body was later brought back and buried in the Frankfort Cemetery. This is the Catholic Church, the Good Shepherd Catholic Church. Years ago, before this church building was here, this was the Presbyterian Church, the one we saw on the other side of town. The Presbyterians originally owned the building that was here. They wanted to get away from the river noise, from the profanity, the saloons where Kroll Insurance is, and those buildings, those were saloons over there. Kentucky River is right behind the Paul Sawyer Library. It just wasn't a good place for a church to be. So they sold their property to the Catholics. They built this building around and over top of the other building. They didn't tear it down. And they worshiped inside the old Presbyterian church building until they got this all done, with the exception of the front. Then they took it down, put in the front part of the building, and they were in business. One of their priests was Reverend Thomas Major. Thomas Major had been with John Hunt Morgan's raiders, was captured, imprisoned, then he escaped and was wounded and captured again, and he was nursed back to health by Catholic nuns. So this changed his life, and he decided he would serve God, and he wound up serving here at the Good Shepherd Church. On the 10th day of December, at 10 minutes past 10, he baptized a 10-pound, 10-ounce baby boy who's still living with us today. It's former Mayor Frank Sauer. And it's just incredible to think that we have that kind of a touch to the Civil War. Mr. Sauer, who's still with us, was baptized by a Civil War veteran. Stranger things have been known to happen. Across the street is our famous Singing Bridge. The old bridge here in Frankfort originally was a pontoon back in the early 1800s, a pontoon bridge. And it was located at the end of Ann Street and went to Shelby Street. This bridge came about much later in the 1820s. At that time, it was a covered bridge. During the Civil War, it was almost burned down, but they saved it and didn't burn it down. It was the famous covered bridge you see in a lot of Paul Sawyer's paintings. And then, of course, well, we'll listen a second here and see if you can hear the music. In Christmas time, you can almost hear jingle bells. Seriously, right? The metal bridge that you see there today is a little over 100 years old. The grating work that's there that makes the singing noise, that came about around 1937. Probably had something to do with the flood of 37 and maybe some of the damage that had been done to the bridge back in those days. One of the preachers was a brother to Henry Clay, Reverend Porter Clay. Porter Clay also served as the Attorney General. No, he wasn't. He was the auditor of Kentucky for over 10 years, had a state job. He would later be the first to preach an English sermon to the folks west of the Mississippi River. At least that's a tradition that is believed today. A distinct look of a lion. Yes, indeed. We don't know why they're there, don't have any idea, but they're there. That was the Buckley building. That was an old hardware store in its original building. It was used, all floors had to do with selling of stove equipment and hardware and things of that nature. When I came here in the 1960s, it was your Sears store. Maybe some of you folks remember those days. Then as we continue on down, we have a rather unusual sight for our TV viewers, and that is the Franklin County Courthouse. They're doing some roof repair work and some renovation work. As you can see, there's scaffolding all the way up to the top over here that goes up to that clock, which, by the way, came all the way over the mountains from Pennsylvania to Frankfort to be installed. This building was built around 1830, 1835, and over the years it's had some facelifts along the way and additions made to it. And as we say today, they're repairing the roof. Quite a few folks shed blood on those steps. Not probably those exact steps, but from the steps of the Franklin County Courthouse. Sometimes if you didn't like the way the judge ruled on your case, you might just off the judge after the case was over. Or the same story would go with some of those attorneys if you didn't like the way they presented your case. Watch out for those cars behind you. This building here that says Duval 1889, this was the location on the storefront there of two of Frankfort's earliest movie theaters, the Crystal and the Gem. And you can almost get the feel of movie theaters in those two spots just by looking at the way the storefronts are located now. In one of those I Remember When days in the Frankfort State Journal, there was a story in there from a lady who used to go there when she was a little girl to the movies. And she was so glad that these films were only about 15 minutes in length. They were silent films because she would have to sit in the chairs with her feet in the seat because of the rats. The rats ran rampant in that structure there for the Crystal and the Gem. Now this building you see across the street without windows on the top two floors, there was a devastating fire in the 1970s. It happened in, I believe, February, and it was so cold that when the firefighters would throw the water up on the building would literally freeze. The water would freeze, and it created like an ice castle all the way around where they were trying to fight the fire. The inside, the interior, from the ceiling all the way to the basement, was completely destroyed and burned out. They never replaced the second and third floors, so that's an empty shell there. We only have the first floor and a false ceiling there today. The reason they didn't put the floors in, the other two floors, is probably because they were not sure that the walls would even hold the structure together. Now we're approaching Frankfort's first skyscraper. We call it the McClure Building. This was built about 1905, 1907. Originally on this corner spot was a beautiful hotel called the Mansion House. This was also where one of our early post offices was located as well. When this building opened for service in the early 1900s, a lot of people were rather weary about going on the elevator and going to the top, because they were afraid they might just keep on going through the roof, or vice versa. When it came down, they might go all the way through the basement. People were kind of funny about things that are new. When the railroads first came through Franklin County, out in the outlying areas at the churches, we have records where the preacher, when he would hear the toot, toot, toot of the train engine, would stop preaching and permit his congregation that would like to do so to file out and go down and look at the trains. And many of them did. Some would take letters with them and say to the folks on the train, would you give this to my Aunt Minnie over in Shelbyville? Save the postage stamp. The trains only went about 5 to 10 miles an hour back in those days, so consequently, you could actually talk to the people. And then after the train was gone, then they'd go ahead and back to preaching and finish up the sermon. Here we have a replica of the, well, it's not a replica, it's actually what's left of the Grand Theater. You can see the marquee area there above Morris's auction service here on the St. Clair Mall Street. As many of you remember, we used to have right behind our videographer, David Pike, was our bicentennial fountain. It was located right smack dab in the middle of this street. That has been taken out and will be replaced in some other area of Frankfort at a later time. That's not been determined yet where they're going to put it. For, I guess, in the 1970s, this had been a street. Then it was made into a mall for about 25 years until recently when they turned it into this. And it's very pleasing to the sight. Some folks still would like to see the former larger linden trees, but this is what we have, and this is what we live with. Now you'll notice a distinct difference in the architecture of these buildings compared to what we have been seeing. These have the Victorian feel, and that's because this whole block was consumed by fire in the latter part of the 1800s, the 1880s. And so all of the buildings were destroyed by fire. Now when we think of a downtown, we think primarily of businesses and offices. But back in those days, you might have 2 businesses and a residence next to them, with a garden, with a fence, and with a porch that extended out across the ditch. Each little street would have its own little ditches for drainage purposes. And back in the early days of Frankfort, when you wanted to take out the garbage, you merely just opened the window and poured it out into the ditch. It's almost like slop. And then the hogs that roamed the city of Frankfort freely would pick it up and clean it up. That was recyclables, I guess, because they would eat the pigs. We had also problems with cattle, cows. One time, there were over 400 animals roaming the streets of Frankfort. That's the reason they built a fence around the Capitol building, was to keep the animals out, not the people. This building here is the home of Victor Kaltenbrunn. He put together these buildings back in the 1880s after the fire. By the way, that fire, I think, killed something like 22 people, as well as destroying all these buildings. Don't move, Dave, we've got a car coming through. Now, as you look at this building here, you'll notice there's a tree growing out of the side of the building. Up there, follow the drain pipe up, and you'll see the tree. Come on, y'all can come through. We thought we got all the trees down, but apparently there's one old-timer that says, I'm going to hang in there and be with you forever. If you look in the middle of this building, you'll see V. Kaltenbrunn. You see right over here, David, in those middle windows, the initials VK, and above it, the name V. Kaltenbrunn. People were enamored with putting their names on buildings. This building here that I'm pointing to, Dave, is 1877, the Murray's building, and the one to the left of it, this beautiful Bray building where Chenault and Hogue Insurance is located. If you look in the circular part of the roof at the top and start looking very closely, you can make out the letters B-E-R-B-E-R-I-C-H, Berberic. The first person to fire a cannon on Fort Hill during that 1864 fracas was somebody named Berberic. Might have been the same family, maybe even the same person. Selbert's Jewelry Store is one of our longest living businesses. It originally was across the street where the Christian Science Reading Room is located today. There's cars coming, so be careful. if Mrs. Mary Alice Selbert moved the business to this side of the street after her husband passed away. She didn't feel comfortable working in the same area that she and her husband had been involved with for so many years, so she moved across the street to this location here. The building you see over here with all the windows at the top, one time that was a speakeasy. The windows almost come to the floor level, so you could actually see if the law was coming your way, and the only way to get in the building was right there at that door at 337. So if the law did come, they could sneak out through secret passages and escape and get away through these buildings. Well, we have managed to tell you stories about people who lived in the various buildings that we've passed by. Obviously, there are more streets in Frankfort that we didn't have time to go to, and there are more stories in our little town as well. So we hope if you folks are interested, you will get a book. There's plenty of material on Frankfort, Franklin County. And of course, if you need more information, you can contact the Frankfort, Franklin County Tourist and Convention Commission. They're located at the corner of 2nd Street and Capitol Avenue over in South Frankfort. We thank you so much for being with us on this wonderful Strolling the Streets of Frankfort tour.